Good morning, church. It's good to be with you this morning. I'm going to begin by thanking you for all of the prayers and words of concern while my mother has been in the hospital. As of this recording, she is doing much better, and we hope that by the time that you see this, she'll be sitting in our den watching it with you. Special thanks this morning goes to Roger for planning our service today. One of my favorite Old Testament stories is of the prophet Micaiah in 1 Kings 22. Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah, the southern kingdom. Ahab ruled Israel in the north. The two kings became allies when Aram or Syria attacked Israel. Now this was kind of a strange alliance. Israel and Judah often were fighting tooth and toenail. It's also strange because the two kings were such polar opposites. Jehoshaphat was a righteous king and intent on pleasing God. Ahab was the worst of the worst, leading Israel away from God into worshiping Baal. But they were being attacked by a common enemy, and as it said, politics make strange bedfellows, so they made this alliance. But before Jehoshaphat would go into battle, he wanted to consult the Lord. Well, Ahab had a gaggle of prophets on retainer for just such occasions. Yes, men could be counted on to say whatever the king wanted to hear, and what he wanted to hear was, let's attack and defeat our enemy. And that's exactly what they told him to do. Jehoshaphat, however, wanted to know what God said. He knew that real prophets weren't so easy to get good words from. So he pressed Ahab, isn't there another prophet that we can hear? Ahab said there was one prophet, but he always gave bad news. So in verse 8 of 1 Kings 22, the king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, there is still one prophet through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, always bad. He is Micaiah, the son of Imlah. Well, Micaiah is definitely not a yes man, and that's the problem. Ahab hates him because he always gives bad news, but he brings him out anyway. And they make a big production before Micaiah comes out. The rest of the prophets give their prediction of victory, even using props and special effects. Micaiah is hesitant at first, but then he is crystal clear. He says, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. Well, Ahab is furious, throws him into prison and says, I'll deal with you when I get back. And Micaiah answered, if I'm a prophet, you're not coming back. Micaiah was a prophet, and Ahab didn't come back. This story is a great illustration of what it means to speak truth to power. Micah goes on to tell Ahab of the prophetic vision whereby he saw that Ahab was going to be killed. God asked the heavenly host assembled around him for advice on how he should deal with Ahab. Now, this is a parable. Angels aren't there as God's advisors. They're there as worshipers. But this explains the reason why the false prophets are given such full sway. Because one of the spirits suggests, why don't you use his own prophets against you? Put deceptive words in their mouths. Ahab's prophets tell him what he wants to hear. Let's use that against him. So in verse 23, so now the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The Lord has decreed disaster for you. Yes, the false prophets told Ahab exactly what he wanted to hear, and he believed them, and he went into battle, and he died. The story illustrates the danger of listening to false prophets. It also illustrates 4 things that are true about false prophets. First, their message isn't from God. False prophets are just that. They are false. When Micaiah begins his prophecy, he starts like this. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. See, the message was coming from God. Earlier, he was encouraged to say exactly what all the other prophets. Why don't you just toe the party line and make it easier on everyone? In verse 14, he answers, as surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what the Lord tells me. That's not what the false prophets did. They made up their message. They told the king exactly what he wanted to hear, which is the second point. Their message was expected. Ahab hated Micaiah because Micaiah refused to tell him good things. He refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. The false prophets made their living telling the king what he wanted to hear. Someone asked me years ago, how is it? Well, it's really a great question about how the Spirit leads us. They ask, how can we tell if it's really God prompting us to do something, or if that's just kind of what we wanted to do in the first place. My answer, maybe a little flippant, but not really. If it's really something you want to do like that, then it's probably not God that's prompting you. Because when people hear from God in the Bible, they seldom are told what they want to hear. Moses and Gideon and Jeremiah and many more, when they first get a word from God, they try to talk God out of it. It was not what they wanted to hear. False prophets, just the opposite. They always tell you what you want to hear. Paul warns of those who teach what their itching ears want to hear. Well, that's what false teachers do. They scratch that itch. Third, the false prophets were popular. They all followed the party line. They all predicted this great and glorious victory for Ahab, and they agreed on it. In fact, Micah, as we suggested earlier, was pressured to go along. In verse 13, the messenger who had to summon Micaiah said to him, "Look, as one man, the other prophets are predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs and speak favorably." Well, Micaiah says, of course, I can only say what God tells me to say. But the false prophets say whatever it is that's popular. And finally, the message of the false prophets ultimately lead to death. Ahab ultimately died because he listened to the wrong prophet. What if he had listened to Elijah, the great interactions between Ahab and Elijah? Or here, Micaiah. What if he had listened and taken to heart their message and repented? This story would have been totally different. He died in battle because he listened to the wrong prophetic voice. Well, that's fascinating, of course, but aren't we supposed to be in 2 Peter? Aren't we supposed to be in the middle of a series entitled Be on Your Guard? Yes. And all of this is background to what Peter is going to talk about in chapter 2. Peter knows that he's about to die. He's going to get caught up in the persecutions of Nero. The church that he is writing to is going to face dark and dangerous times. But the greatest danger wasn't from the persecution, although that's going to be really bad. The greatest danger was that there were those who were tampering with the gospel. There had been false prophets in the Old Testament. There were false teachers in the church. That's Peter's warning as he begins chapter 2. Let's read his introduction to this subject in the first 3 verses, our text for today. But there were false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrespect or disrepute. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping. So, just as there had been false prophets, as we looked at in 1 Kings 22, there were also false teachers in the church. Peter says that the rise and the danger of these false teachers would be the same. They'd cause problems for the church because, like Ahab, the church would listen to the wrong teachers, follow their instruction, and be led astray. Here's a little factoid. This is the only time false teacher is used in the New Testament. There are several warnings about false prophets, like the one from Jesus in Matthew 7:15. Watch out for false prophets because they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And so there's several different allusions to false prophets. And Paul talks about false doctrine or unhealthy instruction. He tells Timothy, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. But this is the only time in 2 Peter 2 that the word false teachers is used. Why? Well, Peter uses false teachers perhaps to emphasize that it's not just their teaching that's false. These teachers are false to the very core. It's not that they're just confused or mistaken by what they're saying. They are totally false, not only in what they teach, but in how they live. In fact, what Peter says here about these false teachers mirrors what we've already seen about the false prophets. First, the message wasn't from God. They introduced, Peter says, destructive heresies, and later fabricated stories. They were guilty of denying the sovereign Lord who bought them. Whatever they're teaching, it denied the very basis of the gospel. It denied Christ and his atonement for them. Secondly, Peter says these teachers are guilty of greed and depraved conduct. They're telling people what they wanted to hear, and they're living that. You see, this was a time of impending persecution. What is it that people most want to hear? How to get out from under the persecution. And what if you were told that it was okay with God for you to live a depraved life, live like the world around you, fit right in with the people, so you didn't stand out and get persecuted? See, Peter taught the very opposite of that. Peter, as he writes in 1 Peter, tells them to live holy lives even if it makes them stand out. So he writes, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us." So regardless of the difficulty, the hardship that it was going to be, live holy lives, even if it makes you feel like foreigners and exiles in your own country. Now contrast that to what Peter says about the false teachers that he's talking about later in the chapter. This section we'll talk about next week. But he says this: their idea of pleasure is to carouse in broad daylight. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their pleasures while they feast with you, with their eyes full of adultery. They never stop sinning. They seduce the unstable. They are experts in greed, an accursed brood. Okay, Peter, what do you really believe about these folks? You see, they attracted an audience by telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Rather than preaching holiness and standing out and living as exiles and foreigners, they gave people carte blanche to sin and fit in with the world around them. And you got to hand it to them. They practiced what they preached. That's exactly the life that they lived. Third, this is what made their message so popular. They followed the party line, just like the prophets that we saw in 1 Kings 22. They told people what they wanted to hear. People listened to them. And Peter complains, many will follow their shameful ways. They pulled people aside. They had many converts, many disciples. Paul expresses as he opens Galatians how quickly they have deserted the one who called you. He's surprised. And Peter has that element of surprise here. The false teachers are going to pull away many people after them. Finally, the message of the false teachers ultimately will lead to death. Peter says their condemnation has been hanging over them. Ahab died because he listened to the wrong prophets. But what about the church? If the church listens to the wrong teachers, the same fate awaits. And that's what Peter is warning. Don't listen to these false teachers. What does all of this have to do with the church today? We live in a postmodern world that is highly suspicious of any absolutes. Nothing is absolutely right, nothing is absolutely wrong, nothing is absolutely true or absolutely false. We may have alternative facts that we're working from, but there are no absolutes. We are encouraged to tell our truth, but people get nervous if we try to tell the truth. We don't like absolutes. But Jesus was absolutely an absolutist. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He doesn't claim to be a way, but the way. He isn't our truth or your truth or my truth. He is the truth, whether we believe in him or not. Well, that kind of thing no longer plays in Peoria or anywhere else in our postmodern world. You can't just say that Christianity is true. That's kind of passé. So what people in dealing with our world try to do is they argue that Christianity works. It's pragmatic. Christianity will give you a better way of living. You want to be healthy and wealthy and have the favor of God in your life and in your business and in your family? Well, then Christianity will do that. Do you want a great marriage? Do you want to raise great kids? Do you want to have a successful family life? Well, Christianity will do that for you. Do you want to be happy and find the secret of inner peace? Well, Christianity is the answer. Once it's retooled, and changed a bit so it actually looks that way. Now, that's not to say Christianity, as it's written and revealed to us, doesn't touch all of those things, but none of those things are the point. None of those things are the focus or the purpose of Christianity. And to make those the focus or the point of Christianity, you've got to change Christianity. That's where the false teachers come in. They change the focus. Like the false prophets, they tell people exactly what they want to hear. Things like sin and redemption and repentance and discipleship, those are all jettisoned. Those things are too negative, too hard. They don't appeal to people today. We've got to focus on the positive things. False teachers, all about market analysis and meeting felt needs. They're all about telling people what is easy and tickling itching ears. And in the process, the gospel, the true gospel of Christ, gets lost in the shuffle. Peter basically goes on a rant in 2 Peter 2 about the false teachers. It's a tirade that we'd better pay attention to, because the dangers of false teachers is the same danger of the false prophets in the story we began with. If we listen to the wrong teachers, we can pay a heavy price. But we also need to hear what Peter isn't talking about. He's not talking about changing how we approach teaching and reaching people. He's not talking about not finding better ways to relate the gospel to our culture. He's not talking about using or not using new tools or techniques or methods. No, he's talking about changing the gospel itself to make it more palatable. He's talking about turning the gospel into something that's less than the gospel. You see, at the center of the gospel is the message of a cross and an empty tomb. It's a message about truth, that Jesus really did die, that he really did spend those 3 days or parts of 3 days in the tomb, and that he rose again on the third day, victorious over death and victorious over sin. Well, that message may not play in Peoria anymore or anywhere else in our postmodern world, but when you come to think about it, it didn't play everywhere in the Roman world either. There's always been something scandalous about the message of the cross. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 18, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. We can't change the gospel to fit in better with our lives today. We have to change our lives to fit the gospel. That's what faith is all about. But it's so easy to listen to another gospel, an easier gospel that fits in better with our lifestyles. So we've got to ask ourselves, are we going to listen to God or to the siren song of our world? Are we taking our lives and bending our hearts and kneeling before the God of gods and transforming and allowing him to transform us so that our lives fit what the gospel tells us? Or are we allowing the world to shape who we are? Are we going to listen to God? That's what we have to decide today. That's what we have to decide every day.